I can clean for you, just for a plate of food and a place to sleep. That's what she said, standing at the threshold with a child in her arms, smoke curling in the evening air. The man inside, the one who once wore a preacher's collar and now drowned in guilt and whiskey, froze. Because the woman before him wasn't just asking for shelter, she stirred a memory. Elias Monroe had buried deep beneath 5 years of silence. You're about to step into one of the most haunting and heartfelt tales from the American West, The Bell of Bitter Creek. A story of redemption, lost faith, and a cracked bell that somehow rings louder than any whole one ever could. If you love emotional human stories wrapped in Western dust and history, don't forget to hit subscribe and like the channel Wild West Drama, because the next bell that rings might just be a story you need to hear. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded coyote that had forgotten what silence tasted like. Dust curled in pale sheets, rising and falling with each step Mara Delgado took along the road to Bitter Creek. Her skirt, once the color of ripe olives, now bore the ash of long travel. In her arms she carried Isaac, 5 years old, too light for his age, and far too quiet. The town rose from the grasslands like a memory someone tried to forget. Its clapboard buildings leaned with time, their paint long stripped by prairie wind. A rusted horseshoe hung crooked above the saloon door. At the far end, near the creek's edge, the skeletal remains of a blacksmith's forge stood, charred whispers of a fire that no one spoke about anymore. 4 wooden buildings, each with sun-bleached faces, sagged under the weight of years and judgment. A saloon with swinging doors barely hanging to their hinges. A dry goods store. A jail with no lock on the front gate. And at the end of the dirt path, crouched against a copse of dead trees, stood a chapel, no sign, no congregation. Just a weathered cross nailed to the steeple, and a bell that hadn't rung in years. As Mara passed through the town, silence followed her like a shadow that refused to fall behind. Men stepped aside, but didn't look away. Women pulled their children closer. One voice murmured low and sharp, "Half-breed." Another spat, "Omen's calm." Mara said nothing. Isaac clung to her neck, cheek pressed against her collarine. His tiny hand toyed with the frayed edge of a scarf wrapped around her shoulders, a scarf once tied by a soldier who never returned. They reached the chapel by dusk. The sky had turned the color of tarnished copper, and the wind had picked up again. It cried through the broken shutters, brushing Mara's cheek with cold, unwelcome fingers. The front door moaned when she pushed it open. Inside, the scent of pine resin and old smoke lingered in the wooden bones of the place. There he was, Elias Monroe. He sat slouched behind a pulpit that hadn't seen a sermon since Appomattox. A bottle hung from his right hand, nearly empty, and his boots rested on a crate filled with hymnals nobody sang anymore. He looked up slowly, as if sight took effort. His face was carved from sun and sorrow, thick brows, a jaw bristled with unshaved stubble, and eyes that had once believed in something holy. Mara stepped forward. Her voice didn't tremble. "I can clean this chapel for you," she said. "Sweep the floors, mend a curtain. Just for a plate of food and a place to sleep." Elias blinked. The bottle slipped a little in his grip. For a second he just stared at her face streaked with road dust, the child in her arms and the steadiness in her eyes. He hadn't heard an offer like that in years. And from someone like her, someone worn thin, yet somehow still standing tall. He set the bottle down with a quiet clink. "What do you want?" he asked, more softly now. "A room," she said. "Just one night. Maybe 2. We won't trouble you." Elias studied her. The child in her arms. The dress stitched too many times. The scarf. "There's no rooms here," he muttered. "I saw the back," she said. "Storage. We'll sleep on the floor. This ain't no inn. It's not a church either." That made him pause. Isaac coughed softly. Elias glanced at the boy. Something shifted in his gaze just for a second. Then he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Why, here my husband said he'd meet us in Bitter Creek," she answered. "He never did." Elias looked away. The wind outside cried again. His jaw tensed as the echo of the woman's words brushed against a locked chamber in his memory. He had seen other women arrive in other towns, always with that same hollow look, clutching silence in their arms. But something about her, the steady eyes, the quiet strength, the boy's solemn gaze, a memory flickered of a promise made long ago of guilt that refused to die. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe shame, or maybe it was the smallest hope of being useful again, if only to someone forgotten by the world like him. After a long silence, he stood with a grunt. "Storage is through that door. There's blankets, maybe a pot for boiling water." Mara nodded. "One condition," he added. "You don't go outside unless I say. No one knows you're here. Let's keep it that way." "Agreed." As she stepped into the room, bare walls, a dirt floor, the smell of old burlap, she set Isaac down gently. He blinked at the shadows, unafraid. Behind her, Elias watched. "Kid got a name, Isaac." Elias nodded once, like a man unsure if he was offering a greeting or a prayer. Then he closed the door behind them. The latch clicked like the first nail in a coffin. That night, Mara lay on a folded blanket with Isaac's back pressed into her chest. She stared at the wooden ceiling above, tracing the knots in the timber with her eyes. She listened to the wind, to the silence, to her son's breathing, and she wondered if she had finally reached the end of the road, or the place where it truly began. Morning came slow and pale, like a ghost shy to touch the ground. Sunlight filtered through broken panes, scattering patterns on the wooden floor. The chapel smelled of cold dust and silence. Mara rose before Isaac. She moved quietly, gathering a rag and the old broom she'd found behind a stack of hymnals. With steady hands and old habits, she began to Each pass of the broom stirred more than dust. Memories clung to the cracks in the floor like secrets. She worked in silence, save for the occasional creak of wood or breath of wind slipping through the slats. Isaac woke, and one wandered nearby, his bare feet soft on the planks. He found a bit of soot from the hearth and began drawing slow circles on the floor. Mara glanced down and smiled faintly. Across the chapel, Elias sat in a pew, motionless, staring at nothing. A flask rested on the bench beside him. He looked like part of the furniture, faded, functional, forgotten. The boy's whisper reached across the room. "Are there ghosts here?" Elias blinked. "Why do you ask that?" "Because it's too quiet," Isaac said. "Feels like someone's watching." Elias didn't answer. Instead, his mind began to drift to a different chapel, one with polished pews and banners of blue and gold. He had stood there in uniform, his hands raised in benediction, his voice strong and sure. He had blessed the 7th Infantry before they marched south, toward the border, toward the fire. His cross had caught the morning light, as he said, "May you be instruments of peace." But they had not been. Not that day. He saw again the burned village, the women crumpled in doorways, the wails swallowed by rifle smoke. He had stood at the edge, his boots clean, his soul torn. He had not pulled a trigger, but he had not stopped them either. He drank until the memory faded again. "Your name's Elias?" Isaac asked. The man looked up. "Yes." The boy nodded, as if filing the information away, like a coin in a tin box. "My papa's name was James," he said. "James Calder." Elias's brow twitched. That name. He was a soldier too, Mara added from behind her, hands still on the broom. But he walked away. Said he saw too many good people hurt for the wrong reasons. Elias looked at her. "Deserter." He said, "Conscience, don't follow orders." She replied, "Elias, almost smiled at that, but didn't. Isaac sat on the floor drawing a bird now with his finger. Did you know him? No, Elias said. But I think I know the kind. Silence lingered again. Then Isaac asked, Is there a heaven? Elias stilled. The boy looked up, eyes too old for 5 years. Mama says Papa went there, but she never says where it is. Elias opened his mouth, but no words came. Once he would have answered without hesitation, quoted scripture, painted golden gates with words and comfort. But that was before the border, before the bodies, before the screams he could still hear when the wind was just right. What could he tell a child about heaven when the last time he prayed was over a burning village? His silence was not ignorance. It was grief carved too deep for speech. He had once known what to say to such questions. Now the answers felt like ash in his throat. I don't know, he said finally. But I hope there is. Isaac nodded. That was enough. Later, as shadows grew long across the floor, Mara sat on the chapel steps with Isaac in her lap. She rocked gently and hummed an old song, soft and slow. Spanish words floated like silk through the air. Duérmete niño, duérmete ya. Elias sat inside listening. Something about the melody pulled at him, distant and raw. He didn't remember the lyrics, but he remembered the rhythm. A night long ago, a woman singing in a barn after a raid, trying to hush a baby that wasn't hers. A lullaby in a tongue he did not understand, but felt in his bones. He stood up quickly, as if chased by it, walked to the far side of the chapel, and sat with his back to the wall. Mara glanced over her shoulder, but said nothing. Isaac, already half asleep, mumbled, Is he sad, Mama? Yes, she whispered, like an old bell that forgot how to ring. Morning crept in, with a shy gray hush. Mara stepped outside, with the squeaky water pail, the air damp with coming rain. Isaac followed close, dragging a stick along the dirt. As she pumped water from the well, a voice sliced the quiet like a knife. Don't think I don't see you creeping around, girl. Mara turned. Eliza Quinn stood near the chapel fence, seamstress, by trade, judge by nature. Her high-collared dress was stiff as her tone. You don't belong here, Eliza said, bringing bad luck and mixed blood. That boy of yours, he ain't natural. Mara's eyes held steady. You're trouble, Eliza pressed, just like his kind always were. Before Mara could speak, a rough voice intervened. She's my cousin, distant, but blood. Elias Monroe stepped into view. His coat hung open, hair tousled, eyes wary. From Santa Fe, he added. Her husband passed. She's no threat. Eliza scowled. Well, make sure she stays that way. Bitter Creek don't need any more ghosts. She turned and left in a cloud of judgment and dust. Back inside, Mara eyed Elias. You didn't have to lie. I didn't lie, he muttered. Blood's a wide thing. Isaac watched them both, silent, always watching. Later that day, as Elias chopped wood behind the chapel, 2 riders approached. Their horses moved like they'd traveled this road too many times. Mayor Silas Blackwood, belly round, voice rounder. Sheriff Pyle, gaunt and grizzled, all bone and dust. Monroe, Blackwood greeted, tipping his hat. We heard you've got company. Elias didn't respond, only lowered his axe. Wasn't a question, Pyle added. She's family, Elias said, curt. She's foreign, Blackwood said, tone sour. That child's a reminder of things we'd rather forget. Elias's shoulders tensed. She hasn't caused harm. Blackwood leaned in. This town has wounds, Monroe. Wounds you helped open. If trouble follows her, it falls on you. Pyle spit into the dirt. No more mercy for old ghosts. They rode off. Elias stood still for a long time. Inside the chapel, the bell hung like a curse. It hadn't rung since the massacre, since the day Elias had reached for the rope and faltered. That morning, he'd meant to call for prayer. Instead, his silence had echoed as soldiers marched past. "Why don't you ring it any more?" Mara asked, stirring the stew. He didn't answer. "It's just a bell." "No," Elias said, voice brittle. "It used to call for mercy. But that day it called fire." He remembered the cries, the smoke, the rope he hadn't pulled, the faith he hadn't kept. That night, while the town slept under a heavy sky, Isaac crept out of bed. He tiptoed into the chapel, small feet soft on the wooden floor. He stared at the bell above. Something in him stirred a boy's hope, a stubborn spark. Maybe he believed sound could protect. Maybe he just wanted to wake the silence. With both hands he pulled the rope. It groaned, then rang. Once, then again. The note was deep, rough, imperfect. But it carried. All over Bitter Creek, heads lifted. Cards dropped. Dogs barked. Lamps flickered on. The bell had spoken. Mara burst into the chapel, breath quick. "Isaac." He stood under the bell, hands still on the rope. "You can't do that," she whispered. "They'll hear, they'll come." "I wanted them to know we're here," he said, "and not afraid." She held him tightly. Elias stood in the dark behind the altar. He said nothing. But the firelight in the stove danced across his face. He remembered another bell, another dawn, another boy. He didn't scold, didn't move. Perhaps it was not just the boy who dared to defy silence tonight. The bell had rung, and the past had stirred in its grave. The storm had passed, but the wind still lingered like a memory too stubborn to fade. Elias stood alone in the chapel that afternoon, meaning only to retrieve a match. But as he passed the corner where Mara's satchel rested, he noticed something protruding from the side, a weathered sheet of parchment. He hesitated, then gently lifted it. A drawing. He recognized the eyes first, then the uniform, the expression. It was him, years younger, shaded with remarkable care. Not heroic, not handsome, just real, rendered in the quiet devotion of someone who had seen him clearly once and remembered. He stared at it for a long time. When he finally lowered the page, his hand trembled. That evening, Elias sat near the fire, the drawing folded carefully in his coat pocket. Isaac slept on the cot between him and Mara, one arm flung over his chest, the other clutching the edge of a worn blanket. The boy's breathing was soft, peaceful. Elias couldn't take his eyes off him. "You drew it," Elias said. Mara looked up. She didn't feign confusion. "I did." He nodded, almost grateful for the honesty. "You remember me." "I never forgot." A long silence passed. "I remember the storm," he said. "A shack beneath the ridge. You had a child in your arms, a baby." Her voice was low. "She died the next day." Elias closed his eyes, the memory returning now with merciless clarity. The rain, the shivering couple, his rifle raised. The look James gave him, different shielding. Mara's eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet still full of something unbroken. "I should have stayed," Elias murmured. "You did enough," she said gently. He looked at her sharply. "Did I beat? You brought kindling. You lit a fire. You gave us one more night to breathe, and you gave more than you realized." She stood, walked to the hearth, and pulled something from behind the mantel, Isaac's scarf folded neatly. She placed it on the table. "Elias Steersert. I found out weeks later," she said. "After James had found me. I told him everything. And he said then, he's ours." His throat constricted. "So Isaac," he began, barely able to finish. She stepped closer. "Isaac carries James's name, his discipline. But his eyes?" She looked down at the boy. "They belong to you." Elias fell silent, The fire crackled. Shadows danced. He rose slowly and walked to the cot. He crouched beside Isaac, studying the boy's sleeping face. Small freckles, a crooked ear, dark lashes like Mara's. But yes, those eyes. His own. Clear as a mirror. He reached out, hesitated, then placed his palm gently on the boy's chest. Isaac stirred but didn't wake. The warmth under his hand was real. Undeniable. "I never asked for a child," Elias whispered. "Neither did I," Mara replied. "But he was never a punishment. He was the only light in the ruin." Elias lowered his head. "Then why didn't you tell me before?" Mara's voice softened. "You weren't ready. And neither was I." He looked at her now, not with blame, but something older. A kind of awe. "I don't know how to be a father." "You knew how to choose mercy over duty," she said. "That's a good start." Elias turned back to Isaac. He brushed the boy's hair from his forehead, then pulled the old uniform coat from his shoulders and laid it gently over him. "Then let me try." Outside, the wind brushed against the bell that crowned the chapel, rusted long, silent. It didn't ring yet, but it stirred. And somewhere deep within, Elias Monroe, something did too. The first light of dawn barely touched the steeples of Bitter Creek when hooves pounded down the main road, sending up clouds of dust like warnings. From the window of the chapel, Mara saw them, a mob of townsfolk, led by Mayor Blackwood and Sheriff Pyle, marching with fire in their eyes and weapons in hand. She clutched Isaac tighter. The boy stirred in his sleep, unaware of the danger looming just beyond the wooden walls. Elias had been awake long before the stirrings of the town. He had known this would come. Bitter Creek was a place where sins did not stay buried for long, and grace was a foreign language. He stood by the chapel door, breathing deep. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped forward. Outside, Sheriff Pyle dismounted, resting one hand on the butt of his revolver. "Elias Monroe," he called, "you've got something inside that doesn't belong here. We won't let a ticking bomb sit at the edge of our town. Not again." Mayor Blackwood stepped up beside him, his face flushed with wine and self-righteous fury. "We tolerated your silence, your drunken ramblings. But this taking in a half-blood and his foreign whore mother, that's a step too far." The crowd behind them murmured, angry faces, curious ones, and some uncertain. Elias said nothing. Instead, he turned back into the chapel and reached for a rope long abandoned. His fingers gripped the frayed hemp. He hadn't touched it in years, not since the day the bell last rang to announce the death of the innocent. Clang! The sound was thunder against the silence. Every man, woman, and child heard it. Windows opened. The blacksmith's widow paused with her laundry mid-fold. Even the saloon keeper looked up from pouring his morning rye. Clang! Again the bell called. And then it was quiet. Elias stepped back outside, his coat open against the morning wind. He stood on the chapel steps, hands visible, voice calm. "Let the bell speak before I do." His eyes scanned the crowd. Some looked ashamed, others indignant. Pyle unreadable. But Blackwood burned with indignation. Elias raised his voice, not loud but resonant, shaped by years of preaching and silence alike. "You all know who I was. Chaplain. Blessing soldiers before they went to fight for your borders. I held Bibles as tightly as some of you held rifles." He paused, his eyes distant. "But one day I watched them burn a village to ash. I saw a man cradle his wife and child beneath a broken roof. I saw fear that no sermon could erase. And I did nothing." Gasps. Someone in the crowd muttered. But Elias continued, "I did nothing. And that silence, that cowardice, it follows me like a shadow. Every time I looked at this chapel, I saw their faces. That's why I let it rot. That's why I let the bell fall silent." He took a breath, then looked toward Mara, who had quietly stepped into view, Isaac behind her legs, holding the hem of her dress. But now I will not be silent. This woman, Mara Delgado, is not your enemy. She's not some curse come to finish what we started. She's the only honest soul to step through this chapel's door in a decade. And the boy? He looked directly at Sheriff Pyle now. The boy is mine. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone swore under their breath. Another crossed themselves. Elias's voice dropped firm but gentle. James Calder raised him. But Isaac carries my blood. Born of a night, not of betrayal, but mercy. A storm, a barn, a promise that I broke. His voice cracked, and he turned briefly, looking to the door of the chapel as if drawing strength. You call me drunk, broken, mad. But today I am something else. A father. And I will not let you take that from me. Mayor Blackwood scoffed, spitting into the dirt. You expect us to believe this soapbox confession makes you fit to protect anything? He turned to the crowd. He's lost his mind. Turned a house of God into a den of bastards. But something had shifted. Faces that once mirrored Blackwood's contempt now showed uncertainty. One woman in the crowd stepped back. Another man removed his hat. Sheriff Pyle looked to Elias. You knew the boy was yours. Elias nodded slowly. Not at first. But God has a cruel way of bringing truth when it hurts the most. Pyle let out a long breath, then turned to Blackwood. Enough. Let the people decide. Blackwood's lip curled, but he saw it too. The tide had turned. With a growl, he shoved past Pyle and stormed off. The crowd one by one dispersed. A few threw curses. One man spit near Mara's boots. But none advanced. Elias turned to Mara. Her eyes were red, not from fear, but the weight of watching someone finally stand beside her. Isaac looked up at Elias, still unsure. Elias knelt and offered his hand. I don't know how to be a father, he said softly, but I want to learn if you'll let me. Isaac took his hand, and for the first time in years the chapel didn't feel haunted. The creek whispered beneath cottonwood trees swollen with the spring melt. Elias walked beside Isaac, holding a makeshift fishing rod in one hand and a satchel of old bread in the other. The boy skipped from stone to stone, humming something soft and tuneless. It was the first time they'd been alone together since the bell rang out over Bitter Creek. The path was damp, scattered with last autumn's leaves that had survived the snow. A hawk circled above its shadow, flickering over the grass like a ghost searching for peace. Isaac looked up. Do fish sleep? Elias chuckled, adjusting his wide-brim hat. Sometimes, but not when you're stomping like a buffalo. Isaac laughed, then fell quiet as he stared at the swirling current. Elias handed him the rod, kneeling behind to guide his grip. The boy leaned against him naturally, as though some unspoken thread had always connected them. After a moment, Isaac asked, Why do I look more like Mama? Elias's hand stilled. Because your mama's beautiful. But I don't look like James, the boy added innocently. Everyone says so. The creek kept babbling, uncaring. Elias's throat tightened. He placed his hands over the boy's. James raised you. He gave you his name, his arms, his heart. But you gave me life, Isaac said, as if reciting something he didn't fully understand, but felt deep down. Elias exhaled slowly. Yes, but I didn't know how to be a father back then. You're trying now. Mama says that's what matters. The line tugged. Isaac squealed, reeling in a tiny silver fish. Elias helped him pull it free and let it wriggle back into the stream. They sat on a fallen log to eat. Isaac dangled his feet, chewing bread. You think I'll be a good man? Elias looked at him, eyes burning. You already are. That night, as thunder rolled far off, Elias sat beside the hearth cleaning his boots. The air smelled of ash and pine. Mara approached quiet as always, holding a folded blanket. "You two were gone long," she said, kneeling by the fire. "Went to the creek," Elias replied. "He caught one, barely big as his thumb. He hasn't stopped talking about it." She paused, then added softly, "He asked if you loved him." Elias looked into the flames. "And what did you say?" I said, "Love isn't what we say. It's what we do." Silence fell comfortable and fragile. Elias glanced at her. "I used to think I saved you that night in the storm. Now I think maybe I was the one saved." Mara didn't speak. Instead, she reached out, took his hand and gently turned it, palm up. There, a burn scar from years ago ran across the base. Her thumb traced it. "You always carry the pain in silence. Loud pain never taught me anything." She smiled faintly. He looked away. "I want to be enough. For you. For him. You are. More than you know." They didn't kiss, but their hands found each other firm and still. A quiet covenant. Later, Elias sat alone at the chapel table. A sheet of paper lay before him. He dipped the pen. His hands trembled slightly. "To the man I was," he wrote, "I forgive you. But don't come back." He folded the paper, tucked it beneath a loose floorboard, and whispered a prayer not to God, but to the silence that had never judged him. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping the windows like timid memories. The fire crackled low. Upstairs, Isaac slept soundly, clutching the fish drawing he'd made. Mara watched from the doorway. Elias met her eyes. Some storms cleanse before they burn. The rain began sometime past midnight, slow, deliberate drops tapping against the chapel's tin roof, like a hesitant knock. Mara stirred first. Her instincts, honed by years on the road and nights of sleeping with one ear open, flared like dry tinder. Then came the smoke. It crept beneath the door like a secret finally told, a thin gray thread twisting and rising. Her heart thudded. She sprang up, touched Isaac's cheek, warm breathing. Then the boy coughed, and she knew. "Isaac," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Wake up, mijo." He stirred, blinking. The smell hit him next, and his small body tensed. Mara threw the blanket off and opened the door. A wall of heat and flickering light greeted her. Smoke rolled down the hallway like floodwater. Orange flames licked along the rafters at the front of the chapel. "Elias," she cried. The old man burst from his quarters, hacking his boots unlaced and coat half on. Eyes red, he grabbed the bucket, but it was useless. The fire had already claimed the sanctuary. "Back door," he rasped, pointing. Mara wrapped Isaac in her shawl and ran. The rear door screeched open into the wet night. Thunder rolled above. The grass soaked her skirts. Elias followed, then froze. His eyes turned to the steeple. The bell. It had once been his shame, his silence. But now, it was something else, something worth saving. "I have to get it," he said. Mara grabbed his arm. "No, Elias, you'll die." But he had already turned. He re-entered the blaze, pulling the wet cloth from his shoulder and wrapping it around his face. The heat slammed into him like a wall. He stumbled past the flaming pews toward the steeple ladder. Each rung was a confession, each breath a punishment. He reached the top as a timber cracked behind him. The bell loomed black with soot trembling on its beam. It groaned as if it too remembered the weight of silence. Elias pressed his forehead to its side. "You were never the shame," he whispered. "I was." He tugged on the rope, unfastening its bolts. It dropped with a bone-rattling clang. He stumbled after it, dragging it inch by inch toward the stairs. The ceiling moaned. A beam snapped. It came down with a crash. Elias didn't scream, just fell, his arms wrapped around the bell as though shielding it from the flames. Rain poured steadily now. Dawn crept in gray and mute. The chapel was a blackened shell, smoke still coiled upward in lazy spirals. A group of townsfolk gathered nearby silent. Mara knelt in the grass, Isaac in her lap, soaked to the bone. Her eyes never left the ruin. Then movement. Over here, someone shouted. Two men pulled Elias from the wreckage. His face was coated in soot, his shirt burned through at the shoulder, but he breathed. Barely. The bell lay beside him in the grass, cracked clean down the middle. Mara rushed to his side, took his hand, pressed it to her cheek. Isaac approached the bell. He knelt beside it, fingers tracing the fracture. He looked back at Elias. It's still a bell, he said. It just sings a little different now. Elias heard him, and something inside broke loose. He wept. Not like a soldier, not like a priest, but like a man who had held in too much for far too long. He cried for the men he'd blessed and buried, for the prayers he never meant, for the woman who had forgiven him before he forgave himself, for a son who saw beauty in what was broken. He cried not from guilt, but from grace. And the rain washed the ash away. Months passed. Spring turned to summer, and the town that once turned its back now found itself listening. On the very ground where charred beams once lay, a new chapel rose modest, sturdy, its wood still fragrant with pine. It bore no grand spire, but in its heart the cracked bell hung again, repaired with iron braces, its voice lower, fuller, resolute. Each morning as the sun crested over Bitter Creek, a child's hand pulled the rope. The bell rang once, then twice. The townsfolk paused often without realizing to listen. Isaac never missed a day. Inside, Elias had taken up teaching. A small classroom had been added to the rear of the chapel. Children from farms and homesteads filed in with slates and questions. He taught them letters, numbers, and stories. Not all stories ended in fire, he reminded them. Some began there. Mara, meanwhile, had opened a herbal shop across from the dry goods art. Her salves and teas healed burns, eased joints, calmed dreams. Even those who once hissed at her now sent for her remedies in the night. The sheriff no longer patrolled the chapel. The mayor no longer sneered at the bell. And one evening, after a long day of heat and bee-song, a vote was cast. Unanimous. The town would no longer be known as Bitter Creek. They chose a name not for where they had been, but for what they hoped to be Bellwood. A place where even a broken bell could find voice. A place where past wrongs did not define future hopes. A place rebuilt, not just in wood and nails, but in courage and Mara. One night, as fireflies rose from the grass, Elias stood with Mara beneath the stars. Isaac ran ahead, chasing light with laughter. I still hear it sometimes, Elias said. The fire, the voices, my own silence. Mara reached for his hand. So do I, she said. But now there's this. The bell rang. Not perfect, but true. And somewhere in the heart of Wyoming, a town listened not just to sound, but to silence redeemed. Because redemption doesn't come from words. It comes from how we live. And sometimes the bell that's cracked rings farthest of all. In today's world, we often chase perfection, flawless resumes, polished appearances, lives that look good from the outside. But the story of Elias, a broken former preacher, and Mara, an outcast mother, teaches us something deeper. Redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from how we choose to live with it. The cracked bell in the chapel stands as a symbol for all of us who've been hurt, who've stayed silent when we should have spoken, who carry regrets like scars. Elias's decision to risk his life to save that bell wasn't about metal. It was about meaning. And when Isaac, the child born from silence and survival, touched the bell and said, "It's still a bell," we understood. Value isn't in being unbroken. It's in daring to ring again. In a world where everyone carries something fractured inside, what makes us worthy isn't a perfect past. It's a courageous present. It's the humility to say I was wrong, and the strength to still do right. Sometimes the people we think are too far gone end up being the ones who guide others home. And just like that cracked bell, when we allow ourselves to speak, to serve, to forgive, we may discover that we ring louder than ever before. Because the loudest echoes often come from the bell that was broken.